Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the seminar sponsored by Tailwind Placement Exams. My name is Patrick Flynn. I am the Senior Specialist with Castle Worldwide and Tailwind Placement Exams, and I'm here to introduce Dr. Jim Wallach and Dr. Sonia Sedeby from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They're our featured presenters today, and we'll be talking about 5 things you need to know about placement testing, and specifically validity. Tailwind is sponsoring a seminar series, and you'll see the 5 things you need to know about placement testing throughout the summer with different subject matter within. Sorry about that. I hope everybody can hear me well enough and see the screen. At this point, I will tell you that we're talking about validity, and when you're done today, you'll learn more about validity in general, as well as about the validation process as it relates to placement testing. It's an innovative series, and Jim and Sonia are terrific presenters, and they've done a very nice job of putting this together for us. So at this time, I'll introduce Dr. Jim Wallach and Dr. Sonia Sedeby, and you guys take it away.
Outstanding. Thanks, Patrick. I hope everybody can hear me okay. So today's series, launching this webinar series on 5 things you need to know about placement testing, is focused on validity. And so Sonia and I are going to start by just real quickly going through what we think are the most important things for you to understand about validity. Talk a little bit about each of those, and then we'll open things up for some questions. So I hope that you've come prepared with some questions, and as you have questions, please type those into the question box, and Patrick will moderate that part at the end. So Patrick, let's take a look at that next slide, please. So number 1 on our list is that validity is not a number, it's an argument. The notion that that there's a single validity coefficient that communicates everything that we need to know about the effectiveness of a test is really a fairly outdated concept. Validity is a collection of evidence to support the claim that test scores can be meaningfully used as intended. So test scores are considered to have validity when the inferences that we make based on those scores, so that is the interpretations, the conclusions, the actions, when those are well supported by the evidence, that they're good, correct, and accurate. That's what it means when we're talking about validity. Validity is always a multiple measures approach, in the sense that validity evidence should really come from multiple sources. The standards for educational and psychological measurement, which were jointly created by American Educational Research Association, American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement in Education, describe several of these sources, including evidence based on test content, based on the relationships with other variables, and evidence based on the response process. And each of these is actually involving multiple pieces of information as well. And then all of this information at the end is sort of woven together into a unified validity story. So it's the combination of evidence from all these different sources that we have that collectively we look at, and that provides our validity evidence. So Patrick, let's see the next bullet here, please. Thank you. So validation is the joint responsibility of those developing the test and those using the test. Again, the standards make this really clear. Testing companies collect their own validity evidence. They have to. And absolutely, you should be mindful of their validity data as you're making your decision about which instruments to use. But once you select an instrument and start using that placement tool, it's really incumbent upon you and your campus to collect local data to support your uses and to demonstrate to yourself and to your faculty and to your students that the test is really working for you as intended. And then the last bullet on this topic is that validation is an ongoing process. Testing programs are doing a lot of their validation processes annually. Some of them maybe they're not doing annually, but they're certainly doing them regularly. They have to be doing them regularly. And institutions should be following suit. They really need to think about this as an ongoing process. And there are certain things that they should probably be doing annually, little things like just checking to make sure that the percentage or the proportion of students who are placing into different levels is about the same as it was the previous year. Big differences in that might suggest some sort of a problem. And then there are other things like, checking on the appropriateness of the cut score, sort of doing a larger study that probably every 5 years or so you want to be sure to be doing. Not necessarily to change the cut scores, though maybe to change them, but just to make sure that they're still working as intended. And then obviously, if ever your curricula should change, or if your faculty are reporting that students don't seem to be placed correctly anymore, we're seeing an increase in misplacement, then that signals that you should be making plans to do a study right away. So next slide, please.
So Jim touched on this on the first slide, but it's such an important part of talking about validity that we really thought it was important to go into it a little bit more in depth. For any test, what we're actually validating are the intended uses of the test and the interpretations that we're making from the score, not the actual score itself. So in terms of placement testing, what this means is one of the primary purposes is to identify the course for which a student is most prepared to learn new material. It's not necessarily the course for which they're going to receive the best grade in, but the one that they're most prepared to start learning new content. Patrick, you could hit the next bullet, please. And it's really important to keep this purpose in mind because there has been research done that has used placement test scores to assess things like the effectiveness of remedial education and to determine differences between various remediation models or investigate retention rates. And while these concepts are somewhat interrelated, they really are conceptually distinct issues. And maybe more importantly, they are a different issue from whether or not a student was correctly placed into a course for which they have adequate prerequisite knowledge to start learning new content. So the conclusion from this often has been that placement tests are not effective. However, it's extremely important for us to keep in mind that solving those issues was never an intended purpose of a placement test. It's really about sorting students effectively. And what that boils down to is a validity issue.
All right, next slide, please. The third point is that final course grade is a flawed outcome variable. It's a convenient outcome variable. I understand it's an intuitively appealing outcome variable, but final course grade is confounded by a lot of factors that really have very little to do with a student's readiness at the beginning of the semester. A lot can happen over a 15-week semester that affects a student's grade that really isn't especially related to how prepared that student was. Right? For the most part, these are freshmen, so students could find they're more interested in the social aspects of college than the academic aspects. We know that course grades are affected by attendance, they're affected by motivation, how much are the students studying and keeping up with their work. Other things may be going on in the students' lives, right? They could be having problems with roommates, with a significant other. They could be just struggling being away from home for a while, or sort of balancing, work and school and fun and all of that. We also need to be aware that in a lot of classes, final grades really don't have that much to do with how well students really know the material, or I should say they're not at least entirely built around how well students know the material, right? I mean, homework is often graded based on whether or not you turn the assignment in, not based on its accuracy. Some classes give you a participation score. Are you there? Just the fact that you're sitting in your seat, counts actually towards your final grade. Some classes give extra credit. You need to remember what Sonia was just saying too. Placement tests are designed to assess content readiness. So any of the variables that go into final grade that are unrelated to whether a person has that prerequisite, skill set, back when the semester started, really just serves to contaminate the criterion variable. So final grades, of course, one of the reasons we use them is that they're easy, they're available, and often if we're doing a retrospective study, that's all we have, and so be it. I know with Tailwind, we're often trying to work with campuses, sort of be proactive and say, hey, how about a midterm score? How about a mid-semester grade? Something that's a little closer to the beginning of the semester, because we think that that's a more accurate measure. It does require some forethought. It requires actually planning the study out. But to the extent that you're able to do that, we think that you're going to be dealing with an outcome measure that's less contaminated, that's a purer measure of the construct and of the individual student's readiness.
So as Jim mentioned, course grade is not the best outcome variable to use when we're determining the effectiveness of our placement instrument, but unfortunately sometimes that's what we have. So it's very common to see where we do correlations, correlating placement test scores and course grades. But when this is done, we really need to use extreme caution when we interpret those correlations. And that's because, Patrick, if you could hit the next bullet, that's because those correlations are actually going to be drastic underestimates of what the true correlations are due to something that we call restriction of range. So remember that one of the purposes of placement testing is to actually sort students into classes for which they're most prepared to learn. So let's say we have a placement instrument and scores range from 15 to 85 on that placement instrument, as we can see in the graph on the right. But if we take a look at students who are enrolled in a particular class, the range of their placement test scores is actually going to be much smaller, as shown in the red portion on the graph. And that's because the placement is used to assign students into that class. In other words, someone's score must fall within a range, in this case somewhere between a score of 50 to 61, in order for them to be eligible to enroll in that course. Correlations are affected by variability in the data. So if we're looking at data or scores for students within a particular class, the range of possible scores is going to be restricted, and therefore there's going to be less variability in our data. What this is going to result in is it's going to result in significantly lower correlations than what is actually true in the population. And as such, it's going to appear as though there's very little relationship between placement test scores and course grades. But in fact, this is really just an artifact of the restriction of range. Next slide, Patrick. So if we must correlate placement test scores with some measure of class performance, such as final grade, then the correlations can be and should be corrected for this restriction of range. And what this will do is it'll give you a much closer estimate to the true population correlation. Next bullet. Regression is also a method that is based on correlations, and therefore it's also going to be affected by this restriction of range. So we need to use caution when interpreting findings from methodologies such as logistic regression. So since Jim and I are pretty concerned about restriction of range in our data, what approach is there that we can take that isn't going to be affected by this?
Which brings us to our fifth and final thing that we think you need to know, which is that comparing correctly enrolled with over-enrolled students provides an appropriate and rigorous indicator of the test's utility. We know that on most campuses, even when the placement decisions are binding, there's some mechanism for students to challenge those placements and to take a different course. So, what we like to do, what we recommend to people regardless of their placement testing program, is to look at those students, who follow the advice of the placement test, and then compare those students with those students who enrolled in a more advanced course than was recommended. So we show here a little table, and correctly enrolled are those individual students who followed the advice of the placement test. And this over-enrolled, the last row, is those students who did not follow it but took a course that was too hard or that was at a level above the recommendation of the test. And then under-enrolled is that group of students who ignored the advice but took a course at a lower level. And what you do when you break it down this way and compare these different groups is that you can get yourself some really good, compelling evidence on the cost of overplacement. Again, looking here at this table, we can see, and Patrick, if you want to click to the next thing here, right? So we can see we're really interested in comparing the correctly enrolled with the over-enrolled students, and we can see that the over-enrolled students are going to do significantly less well in each of these classes than the correctly enrolled students, and that's often a difference, of like a third to half a grade point, which is a pretty huge difference. We do see a difference also between correctly and under-enrolled, but those differences are going to be much, much smaller, and I think you can very easily make the case to a campus and to a student that it's not worth the cost of taking another, paying for an additional course that you don't need to get a slightly, very, very slightly better grade in the course, when you've got data here to suggest that, no, take this course because you're going to do very nearly as well. But don't take the more advanced course because there you're really going to hurt yourself with regard to your performance. And then, of course, once you have these three groups formed, you don't need to compare them on the basis of, grade, whether it's final grade or first midterm grade. You can compare them on the basis of other variables too, such as, drop percentage, course satisfaction, continuation in the discipline, whatever. One of the things that we really like about this comparison, there are really two things. One, obviously, is that it lets us get around this problem that Sonia was just talking about. It's not a correlational method, and so we don't need to be concerned with restriction of range. But the other thing that we really like about it is if you think a little bit about who these over-enrolled students are, right? I mean, these are the students, they're probably just below the cut score. They've met with an advisor. They've told the advisor they really need this higher class. They know they're underprepared. They're willing to work super hard because it's so important to them. This isn't a random sample of all the students who could potentially be over-enrolled. It's a highly selective sample, which includes only those students who are very best positioned to be successful in spite of their overplacement or their over-enrollment. So by comparing that group with the group that's correctly enrolled really provides us with an extremely rigorous assessment for the placement test. So if we can show a significant difference between these two groups under those challenging conditions, then I think the validity evidence that you get is going to be just that much more compelling. Next slide, Patrick. There we go. So that's our top 5 list. That validity is not a number; it's an argument. We validate uses, but not the score itself. Be cautious with final grade. Be cautious in interpreting correlations between test scores and course grades, or placement test scores, and any other within-class variable. And then this notion that we should be thinking about comparing correctly enrolled with over-enrolled students as our primary mechanism, or one of our primary mechanisms for collecting validity data. With that, I think we've hit the point where we'd like to hear from all of you and hear your questions and thoughts. And just before I think we start doing this, I'll also let people know, Sonia and I are going to be at the NCTA conference in like 2 weeks or a week and a half. It's coming up crazy fast. And giving an hour-long session on this very topic and placement test validation. And so we certainly plan on touching on all of these issues, but going into much more depth in this. So for anyone who is interested in more background information, then I would invite you to please come to our talk on August 4th from 11 to 12.
So thanks to Jim and Sonia for the fine presentation. And if anybody out there has a question in the navigation bar that I think you're seeing on your screen, you can type in a question and I'll read it to the group and to Jim and Sonia and let them take it for you. So if there are any questions, please let us know. Oh, wait a minute, I think I see one has come in. Do the numbers from slide 5 represent GPA?
That was slide 5. Was that the one with the table, I'm assuming? Yeah. It does in this case. That's right. It's a GPA that could either be based on final grade in the course or just based on, like a grade on a midterm as well. So yes, in that particular example, it does. But again, the nice thing about comparing these groups is that you can compare them with respect to other variables as well beyond GPA. And GPA would be like grade in the course, not like one's cumulative GPA. That would be sort of an uninteresting question, I think.
Next question, will there be PowerPoint slides available? And yes, we actually are recording this, so we'll have it posted to the Tailwind Placement Exam site, and the URL is there below, www.tailwindtesting.com. So we'll have that out there for you in a couple of days, but it will definitely be available. And you can contact either Jim or Sonia, and we'd be happy to send you the slide deck, or you can contact me as well at pflynn@castleworldwide.com. We'll be happy to send you the deck. Any other questions? Not seeing any coming across. Ah, here we go. One more. We have a vice president who continues to ask about the predictive validity of placement tests. Jim, you want to talk about the predictive validity of placement tests, please?
Sure. So I'm assuming when we're talking about predictive validity that we're talking about the extent to which scores on the placement test predict something else, like success in the course. And this is where you need to be very careful because you're dealing with restriction of range, and we know that correlations are highly sensitive to the amount of variance in a score, and when just by their very nature, placement tests look at students who are in a narrow score band, right? So we've basically eliminated all of the variability, and to a certain extent, we're making the assumption that you could easily argue that placement tests are designed to group people into homogeneous sets so that background preparation is essentially the same for everybody. And if that's the case, then their score in that class is largely determined by other factors that don't have to do with preparation. And that's what we see when we see these significantly deflated correlations. It's really an artifact of that restriction of range. To do a true predictive validity study, you'd really need to sort of randomly assign students into classes and then say, okay, let's look at their placement score, and now let's look at how they did. But of course, we don't do that, and so it's a really, really tough environment in which to evaluate placement tests. And the more difficult, the bigger challenge here is that some of the other variables like high school GPA, for example, or even an admissions test aren't going to be nearly as affected by restriction of range. So those tend to correlate better, but again, it's sort of an artifact. So the predictive validity studies that are out there are, if you're not doing anything fancy, if you're not correcting the correlation, they're showing pretty low correlations. But again, it's contaminated, and it's really not to be believed. When you do correct for that restriction of range, College Board's done some good work in this where they're correcting those correlations. It's very common that they're finding correlations upwards of 0.6, and finding that placement test is actually the best predictor of outcome. But we'll go into this more certainly at the talk at NCTA and this issue, this real challenge with predictive validity. But if you're not correcting it, those predictive validity coefficients aren't great, but they're also misleading.
And Jim, kind of a follow-up to that question, can you suggest a resource or resources that would help us to help him understand that what he's asking for isn't the purpose of placement test scores alone?
Yes, I can. Right now, I'd say the best resource I think will be available in a couple of weeks, actually, and that'll be the slides from our presentation, which I think which really will focus in specifically on this issue and demonstrate the restriction of range problem and demonstrate why it's inappropriate and why it's really unfair to placement tests in particular. And so that will be available through the NCTA website, shortly after the conference, when all the other stuff is posted. For right now, not really. Again, there are some studies that are out there. There are a few. College Board, has one that does restriction of range correction. They talk a little bit about it. Usually, the most that you're getting in any of these placement testing articles is maybe a sentence that says, of course, you need to keep in mind that these correlations are attenuated, are artificially low as a result of the restriction of range phenomenon. So no, I wish that that there were a resource, but we'll have our stuff out there. Right now, there's this presentation, and then in a couple of weeks, we'll have our NCTA presentation out there. If it's slow getting up to the website after that talk, anyone can contact Sonia or me, and we'll zap it right over to you.
Very good. That brings us to the bottom of the hour. I don't see any additional questions coming through. Any other questions? If not, we thank you very much for being here today. Again, this was Tailwind Placement Exams offering up a webinar series, the 5 things you need to know about placement testing. Today's topic was validity. Next week, we'll be doing 5 things you need to know about placement testing, and the topic will be subscores. So if you haven't received an invitation, let us know. You should have by now, certainly, and we would love to have you join us at that time. Jim, Sonia, anything to end with?
I guess all I would say is, if you do have further questions, once we're done here, Sonia and I have our contact information up here. Please feel free to send us an email, and we can try to get back to you right away. Next week's webinar, as well as we're going to do another bunch of these after the conference as well, and they're all going to follow this same general format. Focusing on a particular topic within placement testing. The 5 things you need to know, sort of a short overview from us, and then questions. So be thinking about your questions, that way, when those start, you can type them in and make sure that they get answered during the presentation. But otherwise, I think that's it from us, and thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody, very much. We look forward to seeing you next time.